thank you for those that are signing in, letting us know that you're here for our 1 o'clock. Okay, excellent, excellent. So for the sake of time, we're probably just going to go ahead and get started. So we have Margaret Rutherford here. Thank you so much for being here. I just want to say a little bit. You're going to talk to us today about perfectly hidden depression, how to identify when perfectionism has become destructive and how to intervene. So we thank you for being here. Just to say a little bit about you, Dr. Rutherford is a clinical psychologist who has practiced for 28 years in Fayetteville, Arkansas. After winning the ARPA Award in 2009 for her community volunteering, she began blogging in 2012 and then podcasting in 2016. So as we talk about the future of psychology, I actually think that's part of the future. That's so excellent.
I almost said something about that. And I think, well, that'll be a little self-serving, so I won't do that. But it works, you know?
Yeah. Oh, there you go. Excellent. I love the setup. That's wonderful. I actually think so. I've been hearing a lot of people talk about media psychology and all of that type of thing. So blogging, podcasting, all of that. I think that that's great. So you're offering the public what they can learn about mental health treatment and therapy and what that has to offer them. It seems like you've written a number of things in Psychology Today, Psychology Central, and so forth, or Psych Central. And then you've been ranked in the top 50 of US mental health podcasts. That's wonderful. And a monthly Facebook Live presentation for mental health on the Mighty. And you have a new book called Perfectly Hidden Depression that came out in 2019, which focuses on a much needed light on the dangerous link between destructive perfectionism and depression. So it is wonderful to have you here today.
Thank you.
About what you're doing. And I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Dr. Rutherford.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Holmes. I appreciate it. Here we go. I'm going to share this. Okay. Guys, I am so privileged and honored to be here. So thank you to the committee for accepting my proposal. I have been chomping at the bit, that's it, to talk to clinicians. And I got to do that for the first time this summer because y'all are really the audience I want to reach. Dr. Holmes told you about the book I wrote. You know, I never wanted to write a book. I never had any plans to write a book. And I'm going to tell you how all that happened. But first, I'm going to tell you a story. Back in May of 2020, I got a LinkedIn message from two women I did not know in Florida, and they asked to speak with me. And I said, of course. And we set all that up. And one of them said that she had had a very, very good friend of hers, so she thought she knew very well, die by suicide on Valentine's Day last year. And she was the mother of two, beloved in the community, smart, had her own business, was going great guns. And now she's dead. And at the funeral, the husband had come up to this woman I was talking with and handed her something and said, I found this on Patricia's bedside table. And it was my book. And I don't say that to be, I'll go out and buy my book. The point I'm trying to make is that these people who are using perfectionism as a camouflage for a lot of despair, a lot of trauma, a lot of pain, are looking for answers. And I think it's our job as mental health professionals to recognize them. And that's what all this next hour is going to be about. And it's pretty jam-packed. So I hope you'll fly along with me and we'll cover some things today. Okay, so my son says I always have to let people know the roadmap. So this is your roadmap for today. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I became intrigued with perfectionism, a very brief history of perfectionism research. I'm going to talk about three major typologies that are used in research, the different ways they sort of divide up how you can think about and discern perfectionism and the associated dangers with each. I'm not going to use a lot of statistics. For those of you who are researchers, I certainly bow to you, but I respect the fact that you might want to look those up. And so if you do, there are a lot of those studies that I'm going to talk about that are in your references, and you can check out the actual stats yourself. We're going to talk about how classic depression is different from my term. I'm not narcissistic enough to think that I have come up with a new diagnosis. I call perfectly hidden depression a syndrome, which is, just a group of behaviors and beliefs that fall together. And we're going to talk about the distinction between classic depression and perfectly hidden depression. We're going to touch on when rigid compartmentalizing, which is a part of a PhD. Interesting, sort of ironic, don't you think? The publisher certainly thought so. How that kind of compartmentalizing could actually be adaptive between, the trauma that you suffered, what kind of family or culture you grew up in. I'm going to give you the 10 traits of the syndrome and I'll tell you how I came up with those. I have a funny story about the 5 stages of treatment. New Harbinger, which was the publisher that actually published the book, said to me, okay, well, we think this is an interesting concept, because I thought the book, I would just describe the concept and that's it. And they said, well, we really want a treatment strategy. And I was like, oh, okay. And then they said, and you have 2 weeks. And I said, 2 weeks. Okay. All right. And so I came up with this 5 stages of treatment that many of you, it's not really, I'm pulled from different strategies and therapeutic techniques to sort of amass this. And so, probably a lot of you will just be nodding your head. Well, this makes sense. This is something like I do too. So, it's not particularly innovative, but hopefully it's organized in a way that's helpful. And then lastly, hopefully we have time, we're going to use therapeutic tools for assessment and treatment. And I know many of you are seasoned professionals, and, this may seem a little bit elementary to you, but at the same time, I wanted to talk about it because I do think that working with a perfectionist is a little different than working with someone else. Okay, so let me talk to you a little bit about how I became intrigued with perfectionism. Dr. Holmes told you that I started blogging in 2012, which I did. And it was April of 2014. And I'm looking at my watch. So I'm talking fast, I know. I was out in my sunroom and I thought, well, okay, so I write a weekly blog post. And I thought, what am I going to write on today? And I just thought about some people that I had seen through the years who, when they walked in my door, they might say something like, I don't really know why I'm here. I feel kind of silly. Or they might say, I'd ask them if they were suffering from any kind of depression or trauma. Oh, no. I've got a great life. I'm just a little anxious, or I'm tired, or my doctor said maybe it would be helpful to talk to a therapist, or my best friend knows you and says you seem to know what you're doing, something like that. But they're pretty vague. And I thought about like half a dozen, 10 or 12 of these people. And I thought, what is the commonality between these folks? And what I decided was that, wait a minute, the chat is happening. And so I want to do I have that? Okay. So what I found was, when I thought about it, was an inability or certainly reticence to express painful emotion. They would often tell me about something that was traumatic with a smile on their face, kind of like they were in a beauty pageant or something. And I would say to myself, if I turned the audio down and could just see the video, I would think you were, sometimes I've even said this, I think you were ordering lunch. Your face and your affect didn't match what you were talking about. So I thought about all these people, and I just pulled a term out of the air, and I called the post, "The Perfectly Hidden Depressed Person, Are You One?" Well, lo and behold, it went viral. And I had never had a post go viral. If it had 30 likes, I was ecstatic, right? And I was writing for the HuffPost at the time, and they published it 2 days later. By the time 24 hours had elapsed, I had hundreds of emails in my email. It's like you're in my head. I've never seen anybody talk about this. What's it called again? I had a woman from Fayetteville write, I was going to hurt myself this week, but I'm going to go talk to my family. I immediately reached out to her, and she was okay. But that got my attention, right? So I went looking, and I found Dr. Brene Brown's work, of course, and I don't know why I had not known about her. I must have been living under a rock. And I got The Gifts of Imperfection and read it. I found Terrence Real's book, I Don't Want to Talk About It, which is a great book. It's on male depression specifically, and he calls it covert depression. It's a wonderful book. But I didn't really find, and then I found questionnaires, how to, or workbooks, how to not be a perfectionist, that kind of thing. But I didn't see anything in the popular literature that talked about this, a phrase I used a few minutes ago, that perfectionism could be used as a camouflage and for really serious mental illness, serious depression, serious, trauma memories. Now, when I looked in the academic literature, it was all over the place. There were alarm bells and, researchers trying to get the attention of people to say, this is a real problem. I tell my patients sometimes, if you really want it and it's not out there, create it. So, with plenty of looking in the mirror saying, who do you think you are writing a book? Believe me, there was a lot of that. I got support for it from blogging friends and from people I would let read some of what I was trying to write. I found a publisher. I found an agent. I found a publisher. And then, so that was April of 2014, 5.5 years later, I had a book published. So that is how it happened. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about this brief history of early perfectionism research. Some of this I think is fascinating. Perfectionism was first described as a psychological problem by Albert Pach in 1984. What was I doing? I was still singing in nightclubs in 1984. In 1992, these two researchers, both of whom I talked to, Flett and Hewitt, who are wonderful people, talked about something called socially prescribed perfectionism, which we will get to a definition of those terms, correlated significantly with suicide threat and intent, and none of the others did. I love this idea too, that Edwin Schneidman, who founded the American Association of Suicidology, his research found that unbearable psychological pain, or what he called psych ache, was more associated with suicide than simple depression. Fascinating, this unbearable psychological pain, and he named it. Then Sidney Blatt, in a famous treatise, is that how you say that word? Called The Destructiveness of Perfectionism, said this kind of understanding depression from a phenomenological rather than a symptomatic perspective has emerged as a major trend in both psychology and psychiatry for the past 2 decades. What Sidney Blatt was talking about, when you read the whole treatise, he says, when perfectionism is present, you cannot use depression criteria, the symptoms of depression, to assess the level of depression. And he talked a lot about it. It's a really wonderful treatise. It takes you maybe 30, 45 minutes to read. But they kept on, researchers kept on trying to find this, what is this psych ache and perfectionism? And again, there's a whole bunch of research about 3 different components, which we're going to talk about. The way that researchers divide things up so they can compare and contrast. And they talk about constructive versus destructive perfectionism. It's also called adaptive versus maladaptive perfectionism. They talk about perfectionistic strivings versus perfectionistic concerns. I'm going to touch on that. There's less of that in the literature than these other 2, but they do talk about it. Then probably the most prevalent division is what's called self-oriented perfectionism, other-oriented perfectionism, and socially prescribed perfectionism, which we will define more succinctly in just a few minutes. Okay. Oh, by the way, when I'm in the audience listening to somebody, I like to nod my head, oh yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I've thought about that before. Yeah. If y'all just want to write in the chat, head nod, that'll make me feel good because I can't see you. So, if you're nodding your head, just put head nod. That'll help me out. Okay, so now these are my thoughts about constructive perfectionism. To me, it is a very process-oriented kind of perfectionism, meaning that maybe you're trying to beat yourself, or maybe you are aware of learning. You don't mind making mistakes. you don't like it, but you can say, well, I went in the wrong direction that time and I need to learn from that and keep going. You're interested just as much in the process of what you're doing as the destination. Like I tell my patients, it's a journey. Perfectionism work is a journey, not a destination, right? And so it's also characterized by, again, this term called perfectionistic strivings. And what that simply means is that, you know, you're striving for excellence. You really want to do your best. You are very engaged in that whole concept. I mean, probably most people here have a lot of constructive perfectionism in their running in their veins, right? I also think it's fueled by curiosity, generosity, excitement, and it's an inherent energy, meaning that you know that hold on, I'm trying to switch something here. You know that someone is has this kind of energy when it just kind of exudes from them, right? I had some destructive perfectionism, certainly when I was younger, and I remember a therapist asking me, what do you think would happen if you took the thumb out of your back? And my immediate response was, I would turn into a slug. So I didn't believe at the time that innately I wanted to do well, that I had to keep the pressure on all the time. There's a lot of fulfillment. It's a balanced life. It's not something they can balance work with play, and they can say no typically. Okay. All right. All right. All right. So let's go to the next slide here. And this is destructive perfectionism. It's very goal or accomplishment oriented. These are people who, once they finish a task, they're on to the next task. They don't have that sense of fulfillment we were talking about with constructive perfectionism. Dr. Gordon Flett, who I mentioned a few minutes ago, uses the phrase, the better I do, the better I'm expected to do. And the more I expect to do, I expect of myself. So these are very accomplishment oriented people. It's people who want to win. It's people who their place in the scores. I mean, if you take a test, you want to be at the very top. I'm sure we've all been in grad school and you looked up at the test scores and yours wasn't the top and you were like, oh. So, this is a very accomplishment oriented kind of perfectionism. They also are characterized by perfectionistic concerns. And what that means is that you are invested in other people seeing you as perfect, that you are always aware of how other people are viewing you, and you have concerns that people might see you as a slouch or might see you as lazy, or they might see your vulnerabilities, okay? I believe that it's fueled by inner voices of criticism, shame, and fear. So you not only have external pressure with these expectations from other people, but you have a lot of internal pressure from these voices that are constantly whispering, screaming at you. You're never good enough. Maybe your father screamed at you, you'll never amount to anything. And that's the voice you still hear in your head, okay? You don't have balance, you don't have fulfillment. When I ask a destructive perfectionist who might be sitting in front of me, they say, yeah, I'm going to take on the committee chairmanship of that. I say, oh, okay, great. So I hope you enjoy that. What are you going to take off your plate? And they look at me like I said, what are you going to get naked and go down the street? What do you mean take something off my plate? I'll just stay up longer, or I'll get up earlier. I can handle all this. Okay. They don't have balance and they cannot say no. And again, this pertains to socially prescribed perfectionism, which we're going to talk about right now. Okay. I used this study. There are hundreds of studies on perfectionism. I use this summary of this one, because it is, hold on, I don't know if y'all can see this chat thing. Because it defines self-oriented, other-oriented, and socially prescribed really well. In a study of thousands of American, Canadian, British college students, Curran and Hill, who are also very renowned researchers in perfectionism, report higher levels of perfectionism in college students in the 1990s to the early 2000s. Self-oriented is a desire to be perfect. Socially prescribed is a desire to live up to others' expectations. Again, the better I do, the better I'm expected to do. And other-oriented, or holding others to unrealistic standards. And it's going up. From 1989 to 2016, the percentage of those reports of perfectionism going up. I tell you who is very concerned about this is a sociologist named Jean, I'll probably crucify her last name, Twenge. Her latest book is called iGen. And she quotes such things as, yes, teenagers aren't killing each other as much, they're killing themselves more. She's very concerned about what's happening with perfectionism and isolation in the younger generations. But this is what we are fighting. And socially prescribed, if you remember the early perfectionism research slide, most studies find that socially prescribed perfectionism ranks the highest as far as the danger of suicidal ideation or a suicide attempt. All right, so I read all this stuff, and I wanted to tell you about, I've said 11 new messages. Oh, Twenge's work. Oh, now I can see her. I'll just get a bigger plate. Jed, I love that. Yes, Jean Twenge is fantastic. Okay, so again, this is the me that's talking in the mirror saying, who in the heck are you thinking about writing a book? So I wanted to tell you what my sources of information were. For one thing, I talked to I didn't put this down. I talked to several other psychologists I know about their assessment of perfectionism and how they began to determine, whether it was dangerous or not. I also, at the time I was writing, I had 25 years of practice, and a very full practice. So, I had even had an experience with a patient who I diagnosed with anxiety that tried to kill herself. This is the first story in the book. And I know this sounds like Nancy Drew, but I went on and, I know this is very odd, but I went to her house and she was trying to kill herself. And she tells me now that, if I hadn't come, she'd be dead. So again, I don't do that ever. I've never done it again. There was something in my gut that told me to, and I knew exactly where she lived. And so, with her husband's help, we found her. So anyway, I had made the mistake myself, and I knew it was an easy mistake to make. So also what happened in 2014 is I began writing these blog posts, trying to amass my own feeling of, or my own ideas about what exactly is this? And then I would have on the bottom of those posts, if you identify with this, would you please get in touch with me if you're willing to be interviewed anonymously, if you wish, and of course, anonymously. But I knew who they were, but that was it. And I had around over a 3 to 4 month period of time, I had about 90 people reach out to me. Some of those were not appropriate, but I filtered out about 60 of them. So I spent the next 3 to 4 to 5 months doing 1.5 to 2 hour interviews with these people from all over the world. I started doing them from all over the world, and then my telephone bill got way too high, and so I had to stop doing that. So most of them were from the United States, but they were riveting interviews: a brain surgeon, a motivational speaker, an ad exec, a grad student, a dentist. So many people, different different ethnicities, all that kind of thing. Probably about 33% male and 66% female. And so I started trying to figure out, what did these people have in common? I read studies on perfectionism, and I also talked to Dr. Flett and Dr. Hewitt. And I also checked in with Michael Yapko, who I'd been to several of his seminars, and of course is an international expert on depression. So geared with all that, I decided I would stick my neck out and write a book. So what I did, let me tell you first about the people who actually did the interviews. One of the things, when I would go to different publishers, one, they would say, nobody knows who you are. You're from Arkansas, and you're not even you're not on the faculty anywhere. That's why, one of the reasons why I started the podcast, so I could see if I could, gain audience. And two, they said, why would a person who's hiding buy a book? So I asked the people I was interviewing, why did you come forward? And why would you buy a book? Why did you come forward to talk with me? And I would say to a T, everyone said to me, because I don't want to think that anybody else will be as lonely as I have been. I have been alone all my life. And if I can help other people begin to see this, that this wonderful looking life they create is also something that is extremely alienating, then, I want to help that person. And I'd find a perfect way to buy the book, is what they said. So again, I tried to think about behavioral things, not symptoms. I didn't want to put together another symptom checklist. I wanted to put together a list that someone could look at and go, oh yeah, well, I think that's a good thing about me. Well, I like that about me too. Well, but when you put them all together, they begin to perhaps create a problem. Okay. So here's my best effort at this. And this is an organic kind of list. I'm still working on it. I'm looking in, New Harbinger is interested in me doing a second book. It's still in the iffy stage, but I would tweak some of these even now, but this is what they are in the book. We've already talked about number one, highly perfectionistic with a constant critical and shaming inner voice. Again, the kind of perfectionism that is fueled by shame and fear. I don't want anybody to see how vulnerable I really am. They demonstrate an excessive sense of responsibility. They're always having their hand up in the air. I'll get it done. I'll get it done. They're very overly analytical. They love to stay in their heads. Okay. Or maybe we love to stay in our heads and rigidly compartmentalize painful emotions. There's actually some very interesting research that says that destructive perfectionists can tell you how they feel. They can say, oh yes, I'm really sad my mother-in-law has cancer. I love her. If you say, well, do you need to talk about it? Oh no, I'll let you know if I need to talk about it, or oh gosh, if I started crying, I'd never stop. They don't know how to actually connect and express the emotion, and the research has backed that up. 4 is they worry. Now, these are not people who want to be known as worriers, though. So they worry and they need a lot, and so they grab control of things so they won't worry as much. They need personal control. They need interpersonal control, which of course leads to a cycle of I worry, and then, I take on responsibility. Then I kind of get resentful that everybody's letting me do it. And then I worry that my resentment's going to show, and then I take more control. So it's a real cycle. They use accomplishment to feel valuable. Orientation is to tasks. We've already talked about that. They focus primarily on the well-being of others. Now, this is an imperfect phrase here, not allowing others into yours. What the heck did I mean? I know what I meant, but it's poorly written. Basically, these people are really good friends. They are sincere friends. They are the first one at your door if you have something that's really troubling or a loss of some kind. But you just don't know too much about them. And so you'll think, I've never heard Mary talk about her mom and dad, or I've never heard Paul ever even mention things about his childhood. And, you just realize they do a lot of listening, but they don't do a lot of sharing. They lack self-compassion and discount or deny personal hurt. My favorite story about this is a man who was retired. Had been extremely successful. And actually, at first he came in with his wife, and then he came in by himself, kind of doing that whole, I'm not real sure why I'm here thing. But he was falling apart when he retired. He was drinking heavily. He was gaining a bunch of weight, and he was very perplexed. He said, I wasn't really looking forward to retirement, but something's happening. And I got him to tell me about his childhood, and he started just hilariously laughing. Ha, 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 that kind of thing. And I said, what are you laughing about? And he goes, oh, my mother used to scream at me, get out of the house, you blah, blah, blah. And she would throw rocks at me. And she thought, I was a pest, and she didn't ever tell me she loved me. And I said, oh, and he was laughing. I said, don't you have a grandchild? And he goes, yes, I do. And I said, why don't we invite him into the front yard of my office, and let's go pick up some really big rocks and throw them at him and say, get out of here. You don't amount to anything. And he looked at me and said, well, I wouldn't do that. I said, why not? I said, because that would hurt his feelings. And I looked at him and said, right. And you were that little boy. So why are you laughing? And he looked at me and just said, I don't know. I've just always laughed about it. And so as we began disentangling that, and he began to deal with his real emotions, what was happening in his retirement was he didn't have the constant feedback of affirmation. You know, yes, I am worth something. Yes, I am valuable. And all those old messages were coming were emerging for him. So anyway, that's a really definitive example of what I'm talking about. They use positivity in a rigid manner. It's been called toxic positivity by a lot of the mindfulness people. And they defend the choice by say, you've got to count your blessings, or there's an overemphasis on gratitude. There's a writer here. I'm getting to a new message here. There's a head nodding. Oh, good. Thank you. Susan David, who's out of Harvard, talks a lot about the tyranny of positivity. And she, in fact, I've got her book on my bedside table. She talks about how we are labeling certain feelings as good and certain feelings as bad. And that's what certainly destructive perfectionists would say. You know, it's bad to talk about being tired or fatigued when, you know, you've got so many things to be grateful for. This one may be sort of obviously evident. They may feel immense pressure professionally. Procrastination, of course, is a problem with perfectionism, but I didn't really talk about that too much in this first book. I hope to do that for the second. But they also enjoy tremendous professional success, typically. Because who doesn't like a perfectionist? I had cataract surgery last year, and the guy said, well, I'm a little bit of a perfectionist. I said, thank goodness. I want you to be a perfectionist, because we reward perfectionism in the workplace big time. But they struggle with emotional intimacy. These people might be hooked up with narcissists who want them to take all the responsibility, with underfunctioners who want them to be overly responsible. They'll hook up with somebody else who's very conflict avoidant and doesn't want anything to be angry and wants that kind of perfect looking life. Or if they're lucky, they'll be partnered with someone who looks at them after 14 years of commitment or marriage and says, you know, I've never seen you cry about anything. I don't even feel like I know you very well. And who are trying to reach out to them. I've gotten a lot of emails from those people. This 10th one is something I had to add because of my own clinical, hopefully, ethics. Obviously, I don't want anybody to go around and say, well, I have perfectly hidden depression. That's what's wrong with me. When they also have an eating disorder, or they have generalized anxiety disorder, or they have a secret addiction. You know, there can be obviously things that you can have, or you can identify with perfectly hidden depression, and, you know, have be diagnosable with some other kind of, usually some sort of disorder that has to do with control. All right, ever onward. So how is perfectly hidden depression different than classic depression? Again, a lot of this will be very, y'all will know this, you know this list better than I do. You know, this is the DSM-5, a lot of the DSM-5 criteria. I don't have all of them down because then I started waxing prolific about what I think. You know, implosion of the self, meaning I think of depression as an implosion of all your energy going inward. And the work of therapy is to reemerge with that energy and re-engage with, you know, parts of yourself that you have not engaged with, other people, relationships, etc. Go down to the bottom, Andrew Solomon's book, The Noonday Demon. I love this quote. It's probably the most famous quote from the book. It says, the opposite of depression isn't happiness, it's vitality. So that energy, that engagement. I wanted to touch on the concept of high functioning depression or smiling depression, because people have asked me, is that what you're talking about? I mean, I know I'm depressed, but I can slap a smile on my face. I go to work, I pick up my kids, I do, you know, and is that perfectly hidden depression? They probably, people who do that and their depression is manageable enough where they can pull that off, will probably identify with it, but it's not really it's not the people I'm most concerned about. The people I'm most concerned about They have done this for so long. They've hidden for so long. The perfectionism has been their camouflage for so long that it's unconscious. They know there's something in their gut knows. I've talked to too many of them. They said, I knew, but I would like get up at 2:00 in the morning and look at the definition of depression, and I would shame myself for even looking because I didn't look anything like it. And so there's a difference between this high functioning depression and perfectly hidden depression. Okay, so this is how, when you just kind of directly compare, the depression is very well disguised. No one is coming up to these people saying, back to Mary and Paul, Mary, are you okay? You seem, they might say, gosh, you do a lot. How do you do all that you do? They might be commenting on that, but they're not going to be commenting on depression. They're very active socially at work or in personal endeavors. They have lots of energy. They don't reveal painful emotions. In fact, again, as I said, they may be entrenched in the unconscious. Their mind is clicking along, except in the case of procrastination. Sleep or appetite disturbance could be present, but who knows? They're coping with inner voices of shame, which I've talked about. Suicidal thoughts may be present, but they don't reveal. There's a story in the book. One of the interviewees that I talked to had gone to a psychiatrist's office, and they'd been given one of the inventories for depression. And they'd taken it like someone who identified with perfectly hidden depression would take it. And 3 weeks later, he tried to kill himself. And the psychiatrist came, and the psychiatrist had not diagnosed him with anything, but, no depression. So the psychiatrist actually went to visit him and said, you were just in my office 3 weeks ago. What's the deal? And the man looked at him and said, you asked me the wrong questions. Your question was, do you ever feel hopeless? And because I don't want you to know, I'd say, no. If you ask me the question, if you felt hopeless, would you ever tell anyone? And the answer would still be no. And you would have a little window into how I function. But that's not the question you asked me. Interesting. Therapy focus is inward. You're learning, you're teaching people, guiding people to connect emotionally and recognize trauma as trauma. And I made this up. I used Andrew Solomon's kind of his structure. The opposite of perfectly hidden depression is self-acceptance. And this is my definition: believing that your vulnerabilities don't define you any more than your strengths, and vice versa. Can I do it on time? All right, here we go. Woo. All right, and we're missing it. I want to skip down to the example of cardiology where we're changing, because if you know anything about cardiology research, and some of you younger people might not know this, but a lot of women were going undiagnosed or misdiagnosed, and doctors, cardiologists would say, you don't have the symptoms of a potential heart attack. Well, the problem was they'd done all their research with men. When they began doing research with women, it was shown that, there were different symptoms. There were different predictors of suicide, of heart attack with women. And so cardiologists began using that rubric instead of the one they had been using. My hope is that the mental health profession, and probably many people are, but the people who are dragging out their DSM-5 and staring at it, that they'll use a different rubric. When perfection, just like Dr. Blatt said, when perfectionism is present, don't use that symptom checklist. You have to think more behaviorally. But perfectionism has been seen as more part of anxiety, or what's called a trait vulnerability, which is the research term. There's a theory that Timothy Levine has come up with in his new book, Duped. It's called Truth Default Theory. And the basic idea is that when we communicate with other people, we not only tend to believe them, but the thought that maybe we shouldn't believe them does not even come to mind. So when someone looks at you and says, no, I don't have any sexual abuse, you'd say, oh, okay. Well, it's, again, you may not, but you may. There's a difference. I've already talked about that. The adaptation becomes largely non-conscious. That's Caroline Leaf's word. over time, coupled with clients believing certain feelings are bad and others good. That's Susan David's work. We overuse depression inventories and an overdependence on the DSM-5. And then Dr. Rebecca Lawrence, who's a Scottish psychiatrist, wrote an excellent article in The Guardian back last March. And she said, you know, I have to admit, when I'm seeing 20 people a day and someone comes in and they're smiling and they look energetic, I say, not depressed. Now, she doesn't know about my work and I don't know about, I'm trying to get in touch with her, but she's a little difficult to get in touch with. She's a person who actually talks about her own mental illness a lot. So I don't want to miss it anymore. You know, I don't want any of us to miss it. Now, this is a very, this is a barely, you know, I'm sure you can read this list and say, well, yeah, these are, you know, there are lots of, what I'm trying to say, there are lots of ways, let me put this over here. There are lots of ways of getting around the barn. There's not a particular family dynamic. There's not a particular cultural context that creates this kind of need for this perfectionistic camouflage. It's a whole bunch of stuff. And I've listed some of it there. My African-American clients, for example, told me, several of them read the book and they said, Margaret, if I hadn't been perfect or even better than perfect, I would never have gotten the opportunities that Caucasian girls or guys did. I had to do that. And I'm scared to give it up. You know, it can be from abuse, neglect, enmeshment. It just becomes how you adapt, and or the need to escape. Many people have told me my home was so horrible that I was the perfect football player. I was the perfect track star. I was the perfect, you know, volunteer at the school. I was the perfect drama student. You know, that's what I threw myself into. There are lots of ways of getting this, but so anyway, I just wanted to say that. There you go. Sorry, that was a little confusing. All right, so this is the 5 stages that I came up with in 2 weeks. Because I definitely want to talk about treatment in the next 10 minutes, 15 minutes maybe. All right, the first stage is consciousness. Basically, you have to become aware that your perfectionism is a problem. And this in itself is tough. Kind of like anorexia. Perfectionism is your best friend. And to think about giving it up, I mean, you've counted on it to feel empowered, to feel successful, I literally had a manager of one of the major hotel chains say to me, if I let anybody know that I didn't know I was in control, everybody says about me, oh, she's in control. She knows what she's doing. And if I let any of that show, I would lose my job. So there is this incredible reticence to say, yes, my perfectionism is a problem. So that's the first step. Second step is commitment, because there are lots of obstacles, not only because of the what's the word I'm looking for? The belief in the perfectionism, but because they'll do things like they'll make it too hard. They'll say it's taking too long. They'll say, now, where am I going? What do I want to be? They'll think of it as a destination again, of someplace. Well, what do I need to do to get better? And they don't recognize that it's this more complex process of, again, going back and recognizing trauma and beginning to connect with emotions. I like to think of it as a Jenga game with these people. It's very careful. You've got to let them have a lot of control in the process. So because you don't want to guide them someplace where they're going to fall apart, like a Jenga game. You know, when you think about it, you have to pick the piece that you can take out without the whole structure falling. For me, it was pick up sticks because that's how old I am. But it's kind of like a Jenga game, and you have to understand that these people are hiding a lot of fragility and really respect that. We'll get to that in just a second. The confrontation stage is basic CBT. You look at the rules and beliefs, you have them write them out underneath, write out the rules. You know, I must never show anger. You know, silly ones like I always have to, one of mine from my childhood was I always have to curl my eyelashes 2 and 3 times a day because I look sleepy when I don't. I literally believed that. A silly little thing, but my mother believed in a perfect appearance. And so I was trying to, oblige. And I finally threw away my curler and, I was afraid people would start offering me cups of coffee, which they did not. But anyway, there's silly little rules to really very deeply entrenched rules with shoulds, oughts, musts, have tos, nevers. So you want to look at the absolutes that are underneath them. Then you want to look at the beliefs that are underneath the rule. I'll take my little silly one. I must always curl my eyelashes several times a day. What is the belief? The belief is if I don't look perfect, I'm not valued, I'm not safe, I'm not loved. Okay, that's the belief underneath that rule. So you want to look at the rules and the beliefs. Then you want to help them replace those rules with ones that fit their lives better now. And then begin to experience that emotion that comes with that freedom that they can breathe, they're while also being very anxious that they're not following the rules. Okay. The 4th stage is connection. I use a trauma timeline with this when people are ready for it. Again, the book has 60 exercises, and the trauma timeline starts about exercise 40. So they have done 40 exercises building up to this trauma timeline. Also in the book, all over the place, just so you guys know, I say if you're dealing with severe trauma, you need the help of a therapist. You can't do this work on your own. You shouldn't. It's too hard. And with the trauma timeline, where you go back and you say, all right, I want you to write down all the things that happened to you that were positive and that you remember feeling like it really helped you feel better about yourself. And then I also want you to write down the things that were very difficult, that were traumatic, that were just hard, whether it was being bullied or whatever it was, moving around a lot, being abused in some way. And then you want to use compassion. You want to acknowledge, not blame, because perfectionists will say, I'm not about to go back and blame everybody in my lifetime. I'm going to take responsibility, right? You're not blaming, you're acknowledging. Then you want to have a mindful connection with the emotion. And this is the hardest part for many of these people. And then move into an acceptance, a feeling of self-acceptance, that they can see patterns, they can see how what they did when they were 16 had something to do with what happened to them when they were 6, and then 26 and 36 and 66. The questions you want to ask about that event in the timeline is, what message did I get from this experience about myself or about life? And what did I absorb or come to believe about my capability of being loved, safe, and valued? So everything that they have on their timeline, you ask those 2 questions. Then change, I'm a firm believer. I don't know about y'all, but insight is wonderful. It's aha moments galore. It's great. It helps you put the pieces of the puzzle together. It's really wonderful. But where you get hope is from behavior change. When you always feel a certain way and you don't like it, and you don't feel that way. You always do something and you don't like that you do it. And now you don't. You get hope from your behavior changing. So that's why I really list change as a very prominent part of this model. Now, all these arrows should actually be pointing inward too, because every one of these affects the other. It's obviously not a big circle. And what you do with change is that you take the 10 traits, or this is what I suggest in the book. You take the 10 traits and you pick the easiest one you think to change. Okay, the easiest one. And then you work on, well, what would it look like behaviorally if I weren't doing this? Like if it's somebody who is always taking responsibility, you say, all right, but that's the thing they think could be easiest for them to address. Then you, thanks for the head nods. Thank you. Sit on your hands in the committee meeting and don't volunteer for anything. And I had a woman do that. And she said, I felt so great when I went to the car. It was wonderful. And then here comes this inner voice of shame saying, you're no busier than any of those other people at that meeting. Why didn't you take more responsibility? Talking. Okay. Now, all right. Woo! It's a lot. Here's the therapeutic treatment of perfectly hidden depression. And again, so many of you who are seasoned clinicians know all this stuff anyway. But I've already stressed some of this. There's much less focus on diagnosis. The focus is on behaviors and establishing connection and trust and providing a safe space. Trust is very hard for these people to actually begin to allow you to see their vulnerability, just either mentally or emotionally, is so difficult. So it takes a lot of patience. It takes calm. It takes providing that safe space. Understanding and respecting confusion with and fear of losing control, and even fear of emotionally expressing themselves. I have a woman who I've been working with a long time who definitely identified with this, and this is all she does during the session. She wants to cry, but she does this so she doesn't cry. And I knew we were making progress when a little tear went down her cheek. Small little changes like that are huge. Noting other issues that might be increasing due to stress, addressing if overly harmful. That one woman I just told you about, her anorexia got out of control when we were trying to work on some things. She had been sexually abused by a brother for years. And we had to get her treatment for her anorexia. That's something you all know as clinicians anyway. You want to use a real collaborative approach. You want to have a balance between guiding and then giving control to the client. I often say to people like this, I don't want to be in charge, and I'm not in charge. So if I ask a question that you don't feel ready to answer, just say, Margaret, I'm not ready to look at that yet. We'll go on. That's fine. Your comfort level. Now, I may push a little bit. I may say, well, tell me what's hard to talk about. Tell me what about that topic is hard, or what about that relationship, or what about that time in your life, or whatever. I may ask questions, but I'm not going to say, well, you got to talk about it, because their defensiveness is their protectiveness, which is hiding their fear. And again, the Jenga game thing. You got to be attuned to potential unexpressed suicidal ideation. Two people immediately come to mind that I actually was working with as I wrote the book. And one of them was both of them were so eloquent. And I actually used some of her phraseology in the book. She told me, for example, she said, I feel like I'm finally breaking my silence. And I entitled one of the chapters, Breaking the Silence, because I just thought, that gave me goosebumps. So, but both of those people told me, one of them was in treatment for about a year, and the other was in treatment for about 2 years, that they had a plan to kill themselves when they walked in my door. One of them was going to marry a man who was actually abusing her, but was the perfect match. He held it over her head that she'd had an abortion, and she was afraid he would tell everybody. And she said, I was going to marry him, and then to hurt him, I was going to kill myself 3 weeks later. So anyway, these people sometimes can have they're not ready to talk to you about that yet. And so it's just an attunement and awareness of, if you ask the question, kind of like the truth to fault theory. If you ask the question, well, do you ever think about hurting yourself? Oh, no, never. Think about it. All right. This rest is really, in order to use my model, you'd have to have some mindfulness techniques at hand, CBT techniques, family systems, trauma timeline work. If some people are not comfortable dealing with trauma, and then you can grow more direct and effective with trust. Let me say one thing. I gave you 2 handouts. One is the references, and I have a lot more of them, but I tried to choose the ones that I talked about today. For those of you who are researchers, again, my hat's off. I am a clinician, not a researcher. And so, but I thought you might like to have those references handy, to where you can look up the stats yourself and know, so you can read them far more easily than I can probably. And then I also gave you the last half of an article that I read that I wrote for Culturico, and they wanted me to talk specifically to clinicians about, especially in the assessment process. And I got a few more distinct suggestions there if you want to look at that. So again, for some of you that would be, beginner level, some of you it might not, or, it might just kind of turn on something in your head. Okay. So thank you for listening. I think I've got about 7 minutes, but so do you have any questions or comments? But you got to start at 2:00 with someone else. So let me share my screen and oh yeah, there's my podcast and there's the book.
I just want to say thank you for a great presentation and some wonderful information.
Oh, you're so welcome, Betty. Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. Anybody else? Thanks for the head nod.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. You got to